leaves are falling and turning in showers of golden as the postman climbs up our long hill. I'm Marideth Sisco, and with me is Denise Vaughn. We're at West Vue Nursing Center, where I'm a temporary inhabitant, and the date is April 18th, 2026, and we're trying to satisfy the Missouri Arts Council on some points having to do with me having won the, what do they call it? Living Traditions Award. I am a storyteller by nature and by trade. And I learned that sort of unintentionally because I started when I was 3 years old, and I discovered that when the people were sitting on the front porch in the dark telling these fantastic tales, that if I was really quiet and pretended I was asleep, they'd tell the good stories. And so I learned to do that, and then I started copying them down and practicing them and trying to figure out how they were best told and whether or not it was okay to lie occasionally, as long as they weren't big lies. And I just kept doing it. And they kept sitting on the front porch talking and telling stories late into the night and of amazing people and their amazing deeds in that tiny little town in the Ozarks. So that's where I started, and I just never stopped. And I never realized that it was a craft. I never grasped that for a minute until I was in my middle ages, because I got to California and I was a singer, and I would sing, and I would talk between the songs, and they'd say, "Oh, she's a storyteller." I said, "Really? Who?" I didn't grasp that was an extraordinary thing, and I'm probably happy that I didn't, because I went farther way out on a limb than I otherwise would have, just because it was unintentional. It was sort of just generated by the what was going around me. There was people would tell a thing, and I'd say, "I have a story about that," and off I'd go. And I just never stopped. And I found out on tour, after we'd made the movie and we got the Oscar nominations, and they wanted to do a tour of the soundtrack album. And so we agreed to do that, and I gathered the band up, and we got on the road. And I'd have to talk when we were between songs, because they had to change the instruments, they had to move around, they had to get the light right. People would be making noise in the audience, and we'd have to hush them up. And I just started talking, and whatever came out of my mouth was the thing we talked about. And I've discovered that often I astonished my bandmates by telling stories that perhaps were rude, or that I perhaps shouldn't have, or, well, at least they were a surprise. I had to junk the story about Jesus, but it was such a good story. I'm tempted to go there now, but I can't. So when I came back to the Ozarks and went to work for the Quill as a news reporter, I started getting stories from people that were not accustomed to telling stories to the Quill. And one of the other reporters spoke up about it. He said, "I've been trying to talk to this guy for 3 years. He won't talk to me. Why did you tell her that story?" And my boss said, "She speaks the language." And that turns out to be so. So I can tell a story in the Ozarks dialect because it's one I speak. And I can tell about the tales of wild and crazy Ozarkers because I lived those stories. And when we went to the basement of the Museum of Modern Art in New York to do the last showing of the film before it went out to the public, and there were all these people dressed fine. They had to dress me. Took me to the big stores downtown and dressed me for this occasion because I didn't have any of those clothes. And a woman in the audience asked if there were really people like that, like the movie Winter's Bone, if there were really people like that living in the Ozarks. And I said, yes. And she said, "What do you call those people?" I said, "Neighbors, often relatives. What's your point?" And that's when I realized that I was a speaker for this culture. And I had a little bit of responsibility to make it right and make it entertaining. So that's what I've done ever since. Occasionally I get a chance to sing. How I got started as a storyteller and as a musician was that first of all, as a storyteller, I grew up in my two aunts' grocery store where people came and went all the time, all of them to tell me stories. And I just sat there in my little crib and listened to them until I got big enough to walk around and tug on their coats and make them tell me another story. And that was, I just picked it up that way. Not so much singing. My folks were singers, but they didn't want anybody to know it. They were not interested in singing for the public, even though I donated their services several times, but they'd never follow through. But my dad worked in construction. We traveled all over the country, and everywhere we went, they sang. The song I wrote about June Carter was about that because we were traveling from place to place and singing, and they were traveling places all over to sing, and we were just singing along the way, listening to them on the radio, and had that kind of an odd community with people we never really met, but except for one time, they came to Butterfield, the Carter sisters, and their mother, and they had built them a special stage out in the middle of the gym, so they'd be high enough for everybody to see them. And it was it was just a big box with a big bottom on it, and they were standing on that bottom. And we got there, and it was standing room only. There was no place to sit, and I couldn't see because I was tiny. I was probably 4, and my dad, instead of setting me up on his shoulders, put his hand on the back of my head and just guided me forward between the crowd until I was out in front, and I could see the whole thing. And I was just mesmerized. You can do that? They pay you to do that? Are you kidding me? What a thing. What a thing that was. And in the middle of it all, um, Maybelle Carter, their mother, was the instrumentalist. She was playing the guitar, and she was sitting in a chair, and she moved to get more comfortable, and the chair moved with her and made a really loud sound on that hollow deck that they'd built for it and everything. And of course, nobody laughed because it was the Carter sisters. But then June walked up to the front and got right over the microphone and said, "My mama wanted you to know that was just that chair that scooted." And then everybody laughed, of course. And I thought, oh, you could tell stuff and they'd laugh. And I said, ooh, what a thing. What a thing you could do that and make a living at it. I just couldn't believe it. What a chance. But, of course, it was decades before I actually made that work for me. But that was it. That's the beginning of my singing career. My great uncle, Tom, found out that I could carry a tune at a very young age. And so he taught me the popular songs of the time, which was like right at the end of the World War II. And he was a clerk in an auction house. And every time the auction slowed down or they were having to build up something else or change the scene or something, he would set me on top or stand me on top of something and ask me to sing him a song. And I would sing Slow Boat to China and Harbor Lights and songs of the time, Sentimental Journey. And of course, being right at the end of the war, it made people cry. And I discovered that too. And I never forgot it. I never forgot it. Because if you can make people feel something, you've got them. So that's what I've been doing ever since. Just trying to get better at it. I was preschool, and the whole time I was singing for the auction crowd. And it was the same crowd and the same people that would come to the theater on the weekends. And Butterfield had a theater. It just didn't have a house. It didn't have a performance area. They put up a tent without a roof, just walls to screen out anybody else. And the theater was a movie camera in the back of a big box truck, like a milk truck, where they used to haul the cans of milk down to the creamery. And the projector was in the back of there, and John Hindley would pull up to the side of his mother's cafe and plug in the projector and use the side yard of the cafe as the theater. He had bought a bunch of canvas chairs with backs on them from an Army surplus place. And if you paid a dime, you could get into the theater. If you had a quarter, you could get into the theater and have some popcorn and a Coke. And if you had more than that, you could buy your friend something. And it was wonderful. And they were sound movies. It wasn't all silence, but it was old movies. You could see Tom Mix, and the kids that would take me to the theater because I was the little one, and they'd tease me on the way home. Oh, Meredith's going to marry Tom Mix, and I thought, well, hell with that. I'm going to beat Tom Mix. What means somebody else gets to wear the white hat? No way. As far as my impact on things, and the tradition's impact on me, I didn't know as I was growing up that what I was singing was called traditional music. I didn't know that it was like old time music, and it was what do they say, before 1930 something. I didn't understand that. I was just singing the songs that my parents sang, and they were singing gospel songs and whatever was on the radio and the songs of the time, but with that spin that makes them more the traditional music, which is to say the almost the bluegrass instrumentation, although very far from bluegrass as far as the energy and the oh boy, I've got a guitar and I can play 3 chords. Here we go. My parents were very fond of an artist called Jimmy Rogers, but he had died before I was born, and so I never actually heard him. I heard a couple of songs by him on the radio. I heard a lot of people copying him because he was so popular. And so I was learning Jimmy Rogers songs. I was learning old hill songs. I was learning blues songs, just whatever they could play on the radio. They used to play a lot of gospel music by people would come in and sing live on the radio. And that was kind of fun because they do these call and response things in the gospel music that I'd never heard done before. And then I started going to my folks' family gatherings with the Sisco clan and realized that they all sang those. And we didn't spend that much time around them as growing up because we were just all going from place to place. And so I didn't understand what it was, what the tradition was that I was growing into. But when I came back from California, I had Country Joe and the Fish and the Grateful Dead and all those artists to blend in with the old time stuff, and together it made a wonderful mix. It was fun to sing. It had heartbreaking songs, and people who could actually play music in different keys and had their own instrumentation style, and it was just so refreshing to see those things mixed together and see if you could do something else with them. And I just had a great time with that. And I was especially intrigued when I started meeting up with and playing music with some of the country musicians, because that didn't happen at first. I was doing my glass art, and I was storytelling and stuff like that, and playing some music of my own, But I didn't see myself as part of any tradition until I got back here in the woods and started sitting down with some of these old hippies that had learned the same tunes or had grown up with the same tunes that I had. And that just gave me a whole different perspective on how fresh and original it could be, and not just some old song that somebody plays over and over till they fall over. Um, this was new stuff and original stuff, but with the same flavor and the same instrumentation. What can you do with it? How can you put that together so it becomes all sparkly and new? And so I was very, very intrigued with that, and the more intrigued I got, the more I was interested in the old players and what they knew, because hell, they were older than me. They probably had played more songs than I have. I was sitting across the table, across the desk from Dennis Kreider, who was the sports editor of the paper. He was a fine photographer. He always has been, and is making a good living at it now. But it was 5 years at the quill sitting across that desk before I knew he played a note. It just didn't come up. And then one night he said, I guess I'm going to have to get me some dinner. I'm going to go out to Rick's and play tonight. I said, what are you playing? He said, guitar. I said, what kind of music? He said, well, old time, Chet Atkins, that kind of. I said, really? Well, I sing. He said, really? I said, you care if I come out and join you for the evening? He said, no, please come ahead. Gave me directions out to Rick's house, and he was living in his old house before he built the new one. And it was a boy's house. He had swinging doors, saloon doors on the bathroom, as an example. And it was, just all boys doing their thing. But my God, they could play good music. They were just so good. And so I said, what you doing with this song? Well, yeah, we do. You know that song? No, I have to bring my guitar out so I can play it. And so I brought my guitar out, and I couldn't play beans compared to them. I didn't belong in the same room. But they learned the chords and learned to play the song and handed it back to me better than it was, and so we just kept doing it. Not every Thursday night, but most. And it just got to be one of the things we did, and that's how I got into real being serious about it, because I wasn't just wanting to play a song. I was going to learn that song and get it done the best it could be done. And so I know I've annoyed the hell out of them because I say, no, that doesn't go there. It's not that chord, it's this chord. And they go, really? And they'll really try it. Well, I'll be damned. So, so we did a lot of that, and then I'd bring in a new song, or they'd bring in a new song, and we'd learn it. And that's really how the movie happened, because we had just finished that song, Wind and Rain, that Eileen Welsh and her guide performed. And I liked that song so well, and so we learned it. And we had just put the finishing touches on it. So we had gotten it as good as it was going to be from us, And then we got a phone call, and Dan Woodrell and his wife were in town with these people that wanted to make a movie on one of his books, and wanted to know if they could come and hear some honest-to-God Ozarks music. And we said, oh, yeah, come on over, So we played a trick on them. It was bad. They got in here, and we played this song and that song. They said, well, play something that's like your best stuff. I looked at him and said, so we started Wind and Rain, and I was sitting very close to the videographer, and so I was close to his microphone. And every time we'd get to the instrumental part in between the verses, it's about this girl who falls in love with this boy, and the boy instead falls in love with his sister. And so she kills her sister and throws her in the river. It was one of those 1500 songs that, oh, murder ballads. Let's get somebody. Um, so every time they'd get to the instrumental part in between the verses, I would just kind of lean over a little bit toward the microphone and start making this wind noise every time. And they were looking around trying to figure out, and then one of them went, "She's doing it," but I just kept on, and and that was the song that a year and something, almost 2 years later, Ann Rossellini called me and said, "You probably don't remember us. We're the movie people." I said, "Yeah, I remember you." She said, "There's that one song we just can't get out of our heads." I said, "Wind and Rain." "Yeah, yeah. Could you do that for the movie?" I said, "I'd love to record it for the movie." And she said, "No, no, we have this little scene in the movie for you." I said, "Whoa, whoa, whoa. I'm not an actor." They said, "You don't have to act. You just have to sing." I said, "Okay, I can do that." So we set it all up, and we went out there and did the singing. But in the meantime, they had called and said, that song's not going to work because it doesn't have the right lyrics to it. Okay. I said, "Could you fix it?" "I don't know." Uh, Sure, yeah, I can fix it. So I write the Wind and Rain for the movie, and they won't take it because it's too much like the movie. What do they call it? It's too on the nose. It tells too much of the story. And if you play it the first, then you're giving away the story. And if you play at the end, they've already heard the story. And so they picked Farther Along instead for the outro, and Missouri Waltz for the intro. And that was funny too because they said, you know Missouri Waltz?" I said, "Yeah." I said, What's it like?" I said, "You mean the original?" Uh, and they said, "Yeah." I said, "Well, it's really racist." "Really? Could you fix it?" "I don't know, maybe." So I messed around with it and took out the pickaninnies or whatever, and got it a little more mama instead of mammy, like that. And they say, "Yeah, that'll do." And so I sang it into my little recorder and sent it to them. And they said, "Well, yeah, okay, yeah, that'll be fine." And so didn't say anything about recording. No, I just assumed I'd go into the studio and record it. Well, they liked the version on the recorder. But I had just got out of the hospital with a cancer operation. I didn't have any air at all to sing with. And when I got out and up and ready to go in the studio, I didn't have that voice. I had another voice. And they liked the one on the recorder, except it being a WAV file and being too big to send over the email. I sent the tiny version and erased it. And so when it came time to put it on the film, the sound director called me up and said, "Where is that WAV file?" And I said, "Oh, I got rid of that a long time ago." He said, "What?" I said, I erased it. I thought you had what you wanted." He said, well, yeah, but I said, "What? What's the matter?" He said, "It starts the movie. I need the WAV file." I went into the studio and recorded it 5 times. Never got it. So they took this tiny little file and they added crickets, they added wind sounds, more wind sounds, and they added all kinds of things in the background because they had to fill up that file so it wouldn't hiss. So that's what they got. At Rick's house on Thursday night, you might run into any number of people. Sometimes it was just us, me and Rick and Dennis. Rick was a biology professor at MSU, Rick Cochran, and Dennis Kreider was a sports editor at the newspaper. And they were both wonderful guitarists in the Chet Atkins style. And other people would come to play with them, just like I did. And Linda Stoffel would come and sing harmonies. Once in a while, Judy Dominy would come down from Rogersville and play a night with us, and like that. And I think we affected them surely as much as they affected us, because it was a chance to try out the things you're best at with people who are best at theirs, And it was just a joyful. It was sort of like the music church. And when Rick died, it just stopped. It just stopped. We didn't. We couldn't sit down and play together without tearing up. Ken Wagner would come. He was at the time was learning mandolin, and just getting to be fairly good with the guitar. Now he's learned everything he could from them, and he's quite good, but he doesn't have a place to play either. So these communities can come and go when you least expect it, and for so many reasons, many more than the reasons to keep them. You can't think about Ozark culture without bringing the subject of cultural isolation. And at least half, if not more, of the Ozarks traditions we know about, and many we don't know about, are just products of having to do with what you have with what you have. And I don't know how many people will say, "Well, I would have done it that way. I wouldn't have done it that way, but I just didn't want to go to town, so I found something that worked." You know, and I ended up writing that song. I found the chorus of that song on the door of the bathroom in Jean's Healthway in Ava. There's just a little tag up on the wall that said, "What? Use it up, wear it out, make it do, or do without." And a good bit of Ozark culture is built exactly on that, because it doesn't have any point to go into town to buy something if you don't have the means to buy something. And if you want the thing to happen, if you want the thing built, if you want the thing executed, you have to make it up. You have to do something that was maybe not the way it was done before. Maybe not what you would have chosen to do. But if it works, that's what you have. Go with it. And the fact that we are so resilient and so bullheaded, and that we tackle things that we really shouldn't know how to do, and sometimes we don't. Sometimes we don't have the means. But then what do you do? A kid wants a toy for Christmas. You don't have a you don't have a you don't have a dime to get a Christmas gift, but you could make one. And if you don't have the means to make one, maybe your neighbor does. Of course, there is that awful joke about what was our buddy about the recipe for chicken and dumplings. First, steal a chicken. Uh, that's not very funny, but it worked when it had to. You do what you have to do to get the thing done that has to be done. And that's more about the Ozarks than any place else I know. Everybody else gives up or calls somebody or has a relative that'll pull them out of the ditch, but some people don't. And when you don't, you either make do or you do without. My folks, off and on over time, they had various grocery stores, and at those grocery stores, each one of them had a drawer full of little notebooks, little order books. And when somebody came in and didn't have money to pay, you wrote it down in the book, and they would bring their check at the end of the month and pay you off if they could. And sometimes they couldn't. And you had to decide whether or not those very ill-nourished people with their ill-nourished kids should have another free meal. And all of them went out of the business for the same reason. They couldn't afford to pay for all those free meals, but they couldn't not do it. So that was That was the economy we lived in. And you always took that chance when you opened up business. If you're going to have the gumption or the cold heartedness, whatever you want to call it, to say no. And my folks never could. I have more than once been asked to describe my my view of Ozarks culture or my impact on the culture or whatever. And I often joke and say, well, my only real job is to make people cry. And I'm only half joking because that is part of the job. Because there is such a fine-toothed image of this culture as being poor and needy and starving and unable to make it. Unable to make it. And that's a tragic story. I mean, it has aspects of wonderful comedy in it and aspects of beauty that is just so heartbreaking that you can't help but talk about it. You can't help but tell how that affects you and how you know it's affecting the people in your audience because you're there. And I think that's really the crux of it. You're trying to, as they say, tell it like it is. Well, it's not like that for everybody. But you can tell what it's like for these folks, and you can be honest with them. And I personally think that Winter's Bone is a movie that speaks so vividly to that thin edge that people walk between chaos and destruction, and yet the spare keen edge of beauty. There's no place like it. Or if there is, I haven't been there yet. Because if there was, I'd be telling stories about it. That's all I know.
And who